So hello and welcome to the Chorus workshop, Metadata Gone Wrong, What to Fix and Why It Matters. I'm Howard Ratner, the Executive Director of Chorus, and I've got the honor of being your moderator for today. So we've had over 150 people register for today's event from all around the globe, and today's workshop will run until 12:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and we'll also be recording this for later viewing. Today's event would not be possible without the generous sponsorship coming from AIP Publishing, Springer Nature, Silverchair, and STM. Now, today's workshop will be governed by our code of conduct, so we will have a positive experience for all participants. So please don't engage in any harassment of any kind. Don't post anything that a reasonable person would consider offensive, abusive, or hate speech. Don't post anything obscene or sexually explicit. Don't try to impersonate people. And also don't expose any private information. So today's workshop is the first in a series. It's an effort to gather together like-minded people like you to discuss some of the common problems with scholarly communications metadata. We'll start today's workshop by hearing from some experts in this area. Each will give 5-minute opening statements, including some background into the relevant projects that they've been working on. This will be followed by an open discussion with all of you. And we want you to engage in this discussion. So please do raise your hand using Zoom's reaction button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then we'll ask you to turn your microphone on. Or if you want, use the chat function, and we'll do our best to monitor that. Now, Yvonne, Ted, John, and Mitch have each been invited for their expertise on metadata and involvement in specific initiatives relating to improving the metadata. You can see their titles here, and also on our webpage are their bios. But allow me to kick things off with a bit of background on today's topic and how it relates to my organization, Chorus. So Chorus is a community effort dedicated to making open research work. Our goals are to help our main stakeholders of publishers, institutions, and funders scale their OA compliance. We're working to develop metrics about open data, and we help our stakeholders improve the quality of their metadata related to open research. We've been hosting forums and workshops like today to connect the stakeholders so they can learn and hopefully build trust. When I was putting together the talking points for today, I realized that perhaps it's important to consider modifying the title of our workshop to at least put some boundaries on it. We are talking today about scholarly communications metadata, not just metadata, wholesales. So not things about the recording industry or anything like that. So here, the purpose really of this metadata, at least as far as Chorus is concerned, is about identification, discovery, and access. But as we discussed today, maybe we'll discover more. One example when I was doing the prep for today is I found this CSE article from November 2024. This shows how a Crossref article, DOI, can have things, metadata related to the abstract, the affiliation, funding, updates such as retraction information, references, licenses, relationships, contributors, and you could argue even more. But I thought it was good context for showing some of the metadata that we'll be talking about today. Now, well, what about Chorus, right? Well, during our work at Chorus, we collect and connect persistent identifiers and related metadata for the open research that we track. We do this by connecting articles from Crossref and the Japan Link Center to preservation information from Clax and Portico, preprint repository and agency portal information, grants information, ORCID ID records, and relevant dataset information. So you can definitely see that today's workshop is very relevant to what we do. Now, when we gather all these PIDs with their associated metadata, we present them to our stakeholders in uniform, easily digestible dashboards, reports, and of course, APIs. These stakeholders of publishers, institutions, funders can then hopefully use these to easily track their open science compliance and improve their metadata. Now, today's talk, or at least from my perspective, is all about what are we seeing in this metadata. So I'm going to share with you some good and, well, not so good examples of metadata that we're seeing. So here's some good examples. So here you can see that there's a funder ID and funder name pair. That's a good thing. Here you can, another one is all of the license metadata is included, such as the start date, version type, and license URL. And also you can see the complete affiliation metadata, including affiliation name, ORCID, and ROR IDs. But let's now go on to the dark side. Here you see some missing funder IDs, right? Should we assume that this should carry the NSF funder ID based on the award ID? Maybe. Funder name ID mismatch. You can see over there. The funder ID belongs to the National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka, but yet it says the National Science Foundation, or NSF, the US NSF. And I could tell you the US NSF is often misidentified for the National Sleep Foundation, the National Swiss Foundation, and lots more. Then we have incomplete grant IDs. So here we have an example of an NSF grant ID. It should be reading as CMMI-182-429-7, but that's not what's there. And so the grant metadata can't be connected with the NSF grant system, and that becomes a problem. And the reason that we know this is wrong is because actually when we looked at the article acknowledgement section, we saw the correct one, right? It actually had the whole thing. And here's a few more examples of things that are not so great. Not having all the authors and ORCID IDs for all the authors prevents attribution for all the authors and institutions. And we often see missing affiliation PID names in the metadata. And sometimes the ORCID IDs are only available for the first author. But even when they are, when you go and you click on that thing and you go look it up by the ORCID or otherwise, you'll discover that the author has not made any of their information publicly available in ORCID. And this prevents appropriate attribution to the authors and institutions. So these are problems. And then there are more, right? So you have ROR IDs are not widely implemented for affiliations and even less so for funders. Publisher attributions are often not updated when things get transferred, despite the fact that there's a transfer standard out there. So for example, the publisher name should be updated, not just the member ID within the Crossref record. Publication dates, publication dates are still missing from many records, even in this day and age. And this list by far is not exhaustive. So as you can see, there's lots for us to discuss. And I can keep going on, but I won't because we've got some great speakers here. So I'm going to pass it over to Yvonne so we can get things started. Thanks.
Thank you, Howard. And hello to everybody. I'm speaking from my experience at the OA switchboard. You can go to the next slide, please. We are mostly supporting standardized reporting from publishers to institutions, consortia, and research funders, so the one way. We have about 4.5 years live experience, and you see we position the switchboard as a metadata exchange hub, and we have a nice video animation. We're not going to show it here, but have a look. It's a 1.5 minute introduction to the switchboard. So we know a thing or two about metadata, and Howard was showing some excellent examples because they're real. When I'm talking, I already mentioned, based on the experience of supporting the reporting from publishers to institutions and funders and consortia, we're talking about what we refer to authoritative, timely, and aggregated metadata across publishers. Next, please. And from that experience, having great metadata improves, from a publisher's point of view, discoverability, visibility, usage, impact, and submissions, business opportunities, customer satisfaction, easing, negotiations. Number 3 is super important. I think all of them are, but controlling the open data ecosystem. What do we mean with that? If you don't have your metadata in order, people will go and seek it somewhere themselves, pull it from sites or other services and draw conclusions, and maybe they use it in negotiations or important things. So the point is, if you have good metadata or having good metadata, making them available means you stay in control. Operational excellence, efficiency, cost savings, I'll get to that. A big point in doing it yourself and having your metadata in order as a publisher. Research integrity, having these data, number 6, management information for yourself, but also information into publication behavior. Who are you dealing with? Who are your authors? Knowing that early and having that at hand helps to manage and identify potential issues in integrity early on. Next, please. I was already kind of giving it away. I keep on referring to the publisher and fixing metadata, and I'm going to show you why downstream solutions are not a solution. And downstream means really after publication. When the article is already published, the JETS XML, as Howard, I think, was showing JETS from various publishers, going into Crossref and other sources. If that's not correct, we, of course, at the moment see a lot of AI and wonderful solutions trying to fix it. That is a problem, and not only money, it's wasting time and money, and it's kind of hit and miss. Next, please. If metadata for author affiliations and research funding are added or changed after publication, there's the risk of inconsistency. Howard was already referring to the attribution or the acknowledgement statement in an actual version of record and published article. If somebody, a third party, fixes or changes metadata downstream, there is the risk of inconsistency between the real data and content in the article and the underlying metadata. And there's a risk if a third party does it that the improved metadata are not making it into Crossref. I'm not saying there's no room for improvement at all. There is, and that's why we're talking. There's another risk, by the way. Next, please. There's a lot of text in here, and it's a bit technical, but this is talking about false positives and false negatives. So again, trying to fix it downstream could lead to inaccuracy because it's not right. Everybody acknowledges that and very often claims it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. Well, I think it does if you want to fix and benefit from these things that I was mentioning before. Also, if you want to report to research funders and have an insight in what you're publishing and what's going on, you cannot accept inaccuracy. You can also not accept incompleteness in case there wasn't a hit, there wasn't a match if it's done downstream. So you can guess what the solution is if you look at authoritative data. Next, please. From a publisher point of view, the real solution is fixing it upstream, and that is also efficient. If you look at other industry or any other workflow solution, there is kind of a common rule. So I think it's kind of common sense to do it, especially if it's your own data, but to do it early and fix it once, enter data only once. These are golden rules in database management and workflow solutions. And in our world, what does that mean? It doesn't mean, by the way, that these data are fixed and static and then stay the same all the time. I often hear the solution is with the submission and peer review systems, and I think that's only part of the solution. They can definitely help in extracting and getting correct metadata for author affiliations and research funding at manuscript submission. But we all know that there could be good reasons why things change along the process. So the message here is accurate and efficient each stage, first time right, and only deal with the changes and work on that. But make sure there's interoperability throughout your editorial production and publication process. And integrate metadata creation in all your systems and workflows. So next, please, again, don't do it downstream or don't leave it to a third party. I'm wrapping up, Howard, only 2 more slides to go. So the next one, reminding of the 6 benefits, and I didn't mention the switchboard at all. I'm here talking from my experience at switchboard, and these 6 that I was presenting are totally generic and universal. But there is an added benefit if you have your metadata in order, and that's why we've learned so much about it and we know so much about it. If you, as a publisher, have your metadata in order upstream, you make reporting easy for yourself, you can automate it, and you make your clients happy, or funders, institutions, consortia, and so on. And the last slide, there is even a loop back, because if you're participating in the switchboard, what we've seen, what we've learned is together in our community effort, working with publishers, institutions, funders, and everybody to look at these reporting made easy outcomes and these data flying through the switchboard. We've had many insights and found bugs or identified issues, and the participating publishers in Switchboard have been very quick and super happy to work on that and improving it. So actually, indirectly, by participating in Switchboard, you're also helping to contribute to all these generic benefits of improving your metadata. Howard, that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm Ted Aberman from Metadata Game Changers. It's nice to see you all today. I wanted to talk about opportunities for improving metadata. So Howard, if you can hit next. This is a picture that came from some data that's published by Crossref, and the URL for it is there. 2 data sets. One in dashed is the number of metadata records added every month. And then the solid line up above is the number of records updated every month. So what's interesting about this, Howard, can you hit next? Crossref members are in the process now today of updating millions of records every month. And so I'm not completely sure what that really means, but it means that there's a lot of interest and a lot of actual action going on in terms of updating metadata that for things that have already been uh, created in Crossref sometime in the past. So there's a lot of activity going on in Crossref right now, focusing on updating records. Next. At the same time, if we look at the history, this goes back to 2002 up to 2024 of the percentage of records in Crossref that have funder metadata. We can see that right since 2018 or 2017 or so, it's sort of leveled off at about somewhere around 20% of the records in Crossref for journal articles in Crossref have various elements of funder metadata. So even though there's a lot of update going on, there's a lot of opportunities for adding, in this case, funder metadata, just one item that Howard mentioned. So there's a lot of action and there's a lot of opportunities. The next slide shows metadata from Crossref. Next, Howard, yeah, hit next. And the Crossref metadata schema has a lot of levels of detail. So this is a slide with detail starting low detail on the left and high detail on the right. And it's important that when we're thinking about complete metadata, we're thinking about metadata that encourages data understanding and data reuse. The more detail that you can provide in the metadata, the better. So these are just metadata elements in Crossref. If you hit next, Howard, and one more time. So these are connections to various kinds of related identifiers. So these are things that happen later. These are things that can get added to metadata as a function of time. Next. And next. Contributors can also change as a function of time, and DataCite, of course, includes a wide variety of contributors. And then finally, next. And one more time. The funder information that we mentioned earlier. So this was actually created for instrument metadata, so it's a little bit focused, but actually the DataCite metadata schema has a lot of opportunities for adding metadata for more complete metadata. One more time, Howard. And there's only of everything that's on this slide, only 10%, actually 10% of the elements in the metadata schema for DataCite are mandatory, and many people only provide that mandatory metadata. So there's 90% of the metadata schema that people don't provide in general. And so this is a great opportunity for for adding to complete metadata that encourages understanding and reuse of data. And the metadata that might get added supports a lot of use cases. If we go to the next slide and hit next, and let's just go to next here, Howard, a couple times, and one more time. So there are a number of use cases. The DataCite metadata schema was really designed for identification and citation, sort of that mandatory fields there in the first use case. But as I said, the other 90% of the metadata fields in DataCite can support a whole bunch of other important use cases. And if you hit next again, particularly if we think about fair data and fair metadata, many of these other use cases are really important for supporting the other use cases, accessibility and interoperability and reuse in FAIR. Next, Howard. It's important to think about this also as not something that we have to do on day one or day two, but actually a continuous improvement process that organizations that run repositories can take part in, where they iterate through the metadata and fix or add fix information or add information in a series of iterations over time. And in each of those iterations, it's important to measure things, to identify opportunities for improvement, and then execute those opportunities for improvement, and then measure again and come back again in another pass. So that means that measurement is very important. Next slide, Howard. So in this slide, next, we look at a radar plot next. And around the outside of the circle are metadata elements. In this case, metadata elements from DataCite that supports text search or the text search use case. This is sort of one of the findability use cases. And along the radius of this radar plot, next, we measure things at the middle have 0% of the records in this repository have this element. And then on things that are on the outer edge have 100% of the records in the repository have whatever element we are. In the green box at the top, it's a score, 79% in this case. And but this allows us to, I'm a sort of a visual learner myself, so this allows me to look at a picture and get an idea of how complete the metadata in a repository is. And then if we look at the next slide and hit next one more time, this is the University of Bath, which I looked at metadata for about 400 universities, and the University of Bath had the most complete metadata, actually, by far. And this was in January of 2024, so that the four use cases for FAIR, text and identifiers and connections and contacts, allow us to get a pretty good picture of about 60 metadata elements that are in this repository. And their score of 46% was really outstanding among 400. I found out that they were then, after I published this, they were doing a project to improve, particularly RORs and other things. So next, Howard. So between January and September of 2024, they improved completeness of their metadata significantly. So here you can see that the brown part of these, or the tan part of these plots, are things that got added, and they went from essentially being in no records to being in all records. So this was a huge project that was done. And one more time, Howard. And these are the things that they added. So that I mentioned RORs already, organizational identifiers, some more ORCIDs, identifiers for people, resource types for some of their data sets, and also information about rights holders. So the overall score for this repository went from 46% to 59%. If we look at 400 university repositories, the average is 23%. So this is significantly more complete. And one more time, Howard. And one more time. So I contacted the University of Bath Library, and this is the part of the email response that I got. So I've been active in metadata scene for research data for many years. So I feel duty bound to ensure that the metadata I'm responsible for exemplifies good practice. Next, Howard. Often that feels like an abstract and theoretical ambition. So it's gratifying that the work we're putting in is noticeable and indeed has been noticed. And one more time. And so this came from Alexander Ball, who's the research librarian responsible, one of them responsible for this amazingly complete metadata. And so this is really what I really wanted to talk about in terms of improving metadata, is measuring those improvements, measuring them quantitatively so that we can demonstrate them. And then most importantly, we can find the people that are making those improvements, and we can give them some visibility. We can bring them together. They can share the tools that they're using and the approaches that they're using, and sort of the philosophy that's driving their work. And finding these people, these bright spots, and bringing them together is really one of the most exciting things for me. If you've got people that are working hard in your repository and you want to try and give them some credit and some more notoriety, let me know. Here's a number of recent things that talk about what we've been doing. And thank you very much.
Hello, my name is John Chodacki. I am the director of the University of California Curation Center at California Digital Library in California, US. And I'm here to discuss a project that we're working on with the many community stakeholders called COMET. So the next slide. So COMET is a collaborative Open Metadata Enrichment Task Force. We are a group of people, like many of you around the table today and the presenters, who are passionate about persistent identifiers and really care about metadata. And I think that's important for us to just take a, state the obvious, which is that we are all here talking about metadata and the problems that and the challenges that we see with persistent identifiers and metadata. But in no way does that mean that we disrespect or don't want persistent identifiers to succeed. It's actually the opposite. When you love something, you want to take care of it. You know that it can have all the warts and freckles and, issues that you want to, regardless, you want to make sure that it's successful. And so really what we're trying to talk about here around metadata and metadata enrichment and improvement is, how do you make something that is essential to research and essential to the world even better? Next slide. We all need, as Howard said, Yvonne said, Ted said, we all need persistent identifiers and we all need high quality metadata. The research community demands it and expects it. And one of the challenges that we have right now is that there is this disconnect that has been highlighted in the previous presentations. Next slide. So the current model, just to kind of refresh people's memory, is that the person who deposits and creates an identifier is the one who ends up being in charge of any future updates. So as Ted was mentioning, for example, with the University of Bath, they created those DataCite DOIs, and they're the ones who would be able to update those records. Next slide. So that is both a bug and a feature. We really want to make sure that there is provenance and there is the ability for people who create persistent identifiers to be the ones in charge. However, as we've heard from others, a lot of the enrichment and the improvement that happens in the metadata community is happening outside of those places. And we have great initiatives like Chorus and OA Switchboard and metadata game changers that are working on how to find better information and enrich information. And so we end up with these silos of better information that are detached from those depositors. Next slide. And so both as I said, as both as a feature and a bug, we end up in a situation where the creator of those metadata records and persistent identifiers end up having different and sometimes less complete and less good information than others out in the community. Next slide. And that's what the COMET task force came together to discuss. This is not a new idea. This is one that many people have been discussing for a while, which is how do we bring together the community to find solutions to de-siloing our work. A lot of duplicated efforts exist in our community. Again, it's a feature and a bug, so we want to respect the fact that there is a lot of effort that's happening that's important, and that these technologies that we're working within are essential and important. But we also want to think about how do we de-silo to avoid operational risks and really make sure that we have clear tracking and we can start to create more efficiencies in our ecosystem. Next slide. So to change this, we came together with a group of people to discuss how we could build a shared system to collect, validate, and include all these different siloed materials in some sort of rationalized way. Next slide. So the model that we looked at and we're exploring and we're promoting and we'd love your input on and help with is how do we bring those different systems together and allow for the DOI records or whatever persistent identifier we're talking about to be updated through community effort. Next slide. So this really would potentially be something that can happen through the efforts of all of you, all of us. It's not something that one group's going to do on their own. It's going to need to have the community come together. And that requires not just community effort, but also transparency and validation of efforts. Also flexibility and understanding that there's going to be need to be changing of the way that people are working. But also really just the idea that enrichments are something that the community is already doing and really just a rationalization of those efforts. So the COMET task force, if you go to the next slide and then just on to the next one, it's really a bunch of people that came together, in that previous slide, of people who were interested in tackling this and thinking about how we can take next steps, building off of past efforts, current initiatives, all of us around the room here today, and looking for how we can build a better future together. And so for the last 4 months, we've done a series of listening sessions, and we're now in a period where we're doing a call to action. So we're looking for people in the ecosystem who are willing and interested in donating in resources, either funding or in-kind contributions, to help with building pipelines and technologies, as well as the social side of this effort, to bring together, aggregate, validate, and expose enrichments that are happening throughout the community, and then incentivizing and creating pipelines for the round tripping back to the source metadata so that we can all have better information further upstream. Next slide. So how you can help is we do have on our website, which is at cometadata.org. You can respond to the community call to action, but also if you have friends or colleagues that are interested in these types of efforts, please share just the idea with your networks. If there are groups that you know who have tackled this in the past that we may or may not be informed of, please let us know. And we would just love for people to stay involved as we move forward with pilot projects throughout the summer. Next slide. So the Comet Task Force, again, it's not top down. It's really a organization it's a group that's come together and been organized using people who are interested and passionate about this. So I am one of the conveners, but there are people who are coming from around the world to tackle this together. So if you have, or if you know of anybody who has resources who are interested in being involved in the conversation, or actually can and are interested in donating in resources, you can contact us. And the next slide is contact information. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, John. I am Mitchell Bakos with the American Chemical Society, and I'm here to talk today about some of the progress that we made with the STM Task and Finish group on Article 3 and Article 4 of the EU Digital Signal Market Directives. So if those of you are not familiar with that, that's really having to deal with text and data mining, where they wanted much of the TDM actors and the publishers, for that matter, wanted a way to, and the EU wanted to mandate a way to have a machine readable means for doing rights reservation. So as we did this, it sounds like, yeah, that's a very small part of metadata. We actually serendipitously found that this actually we have solutions that can be applied to all kinds of different metadata, and I'll show that a little bit later. So next, please. So one of the challenges we had with the STM group and the Task and Finish group was that we had content, as you all know, that can be distributed outside of the publisher's website. So how do we communicate that rights reservation when that content now is out of our control? So we needed a way to make it so that it would follow with the content in some ways. But also this needed to be general purpose, because this is an EU directive across all. It needed to be adopted by TDM actors as well as the publishers themselves. So next, please. So we ultimately ended up with a W3C recommendation called TDM Rep. Now that has its initial recommendation had to deal with website content, HTML, EPUB, things like that. And you can see here there are 3 different means of how you can implement that, but it's very much the advantages to these were it's very simple to implement. It is very much like a robots TXT. So it's very much for crawlers that are doing, say, search indexing, but this is maybe for AI bots now, where you can say, hey, this site or these directories have this policy file associated with it that gives you these rights. So the advantage to this, and we'll get into that a little bit later, is that you can communicate more than just, yes, you have rights to this, or no, you don't. You can communicate what type of rights you have or what duties you have as part of that. So please, next one, please. So what we did was with our Task and Finish group is we extended that recommendation to include PDF. So as part of XMP metadata, that the reservation flag, yes or no, as well as the policy file is now included in XMP metadata. So this also gave us a better idea that now we can extend this with XMP to other things like images, other things that actually take on XMP metadata. We are also looking now at extending beyond that to, say, XML and things like that. And we also recommended in this that a cross-ref deposit as well, so that you could actually update that metadata and say, here's the policy file for anything that's used for text and data mining actors. Next, please. So what we also did is the recommendation is flexible enough that it uses something called Open Digital Rights Language. So this ODRL allows you to communicate what can be done with rights. So what we extended was, okay, if you're an Article 3 or Article 4 actor, what can you do with this? So we were able to have it so that you can say, I want to obtain consent. So I need to go contact the publisher, or yes, you have rights to this. But you need to provide attribution, and here's how you have to what attribution you have to apply. So that it was allowed to give us an extension and provide much more information, and it is even more extensible. So if anybody wants to add more to this, they can. So next, please. So the big advantage to this too is you create one policy file, that ODRL policy file that you saw the example. Any content can point to that one file. So you're not updating every piece of content that's out there to point to and have it update the actual metadata in there. You're pointing to one file and having it, then you can add and change things as you go. So next slide, please. Is that the next one? Let's see. Yep, there we go. Okay. Okay. So the other thing that we had started looking at was, is there other options out there? Because let's say you embed the policy URL and the rights reservation flag in a PDF, that can be stripped out. So how do you know whether something's been tampered with or if it is genuine that you're coming across? So we came across ISCC codes. So this is an ISO standard, and you can go to iscc.codes as the website. But what it does is it basically hashes any content that you feed it. And this can be anything, images, PDFs, websites, anything like that, and will generate a code. That code has the 4 different sections to it. So the metadata, the content data, and then there is basically a blockchain integrity piece to this as well. But what happens then is if somebody, when you publish content, you can get an ISCC code and generate it. But when you come across content out in the web, you can then generate another code for that content and see the similarity between these two. So you may see that somebody stripped out metadata content from this piece of content. So the ISCC code will say this has 75% of the metadata similarity to the original, or it will match against other pieces of content and say, this content that you're viewing is 65% or 75% the same as this other content. And this other content has this kind of metadata embedded in it. So it then allowed us to say, okay, wait a minute, now this is more permanent. And if something gets manipulated, it can be now looked at and verified. So next, please. So there are public registries. So there are service providers, various ones out there that when you make these ISCC codes, you deposit that into a registry so that way it can be looked up by others. You can then also, with that registry, deposit additional information and additional metadata in there. So bear in mind, these registries and these ISCC codes are not industry specific. They are general. They are meant for across any kind of industry as well. But then you can then incorporate things like your rights reservation TDM policy file in there, or any other metadata for that matter. And then companies like Lithium that do this public registry, they also have widgets that you can use in your browser to say, I've seen this content here on this website. what is this? Is this similar to anybody else? And it will tell you what's if this is similar and how it's similar. And I believe that's all I have for this.
That's amazing. Thanks to everyone for those presentations. Now let's get to the panel and audience QA discussion. So again, we do want you to engage in this discussion. So if you've got something to say, just please, or a question, please raise your hand, and then we'll ask you to turn your microphone on or use the chat function. And our staff is going to try to add some key points to a Zoom whiteboard as we go forward. And so if I can ask all of the speakers to turn their videos back on, that'd be great. I'm going to stop sharing. Oh. So again, thanks to the speakers for doing all that. That's great. And by the way, the whiteboard here is just for us to take notes as we gather together. This is all meant to be interactive. This is our first experiment into doing workshops online like this. Usually we do them in person. So let me ask the panelists, in your opinions, what are the biggest risks of bad metadata today? Like if we don't have good metadata, how is that really going to impact us in the community? Anyone want to jump on that? All right, go ahead, Ted.
Hey, Howard, I think we need to I think bad metadata is sort of pretty broad. So, what I really focus on in terms of metadata is completeness and consistency. Those are two things that I can measure, and they can either be low or high. So, I would say the risks of incomplete metadata are that people discover things. Most metadata focuses on findability or identification and citation, like DataCite has for many years. And so people find things, but then they can't understand them. And they don't want to reuse them because they can't understand them, and the metadata is weak. So that's, I would say, is the risk. Their metadata supports a wide variety of use cases, all kinds of things. And if you're only doing one of them, then you're not getting the benefit of well-documented data, or well-documented papers, or well-documented other kinds of research outputs. So I would say the risk is just not. It's really just a missed opportunity, rather maybe than a risk.
Okay. Anyone else? Mitch?
I deal a lot with our legal departments, and that the big risk for them is that if we're missing metadata, or if it's been changed, or that can lead to legal issues in a lot of ways. So having metadata that is current, or having metadata that is persistent, is something that's, from a legal standpoint, very important.
Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I'll raise my hand from now on.
You guys
Yeah, you could. We can be really basic or dramatic about it. If I'm dramatic, I would say it's survival. Honestly, it's if you're an organization or a publisher, it's survival. A more basic, I would say, is hygiene. It's such common sense. You just have to have it. How could you not? I cannot say more about it. How could you not? How could you run an organization? How could you run a business? I flagged 6 things, the benefits of metadata. The reverse is obviously the risk, but again, I think it's hygiene, common sense, and if you're dramatic about it, it's your survival.
John?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think when you look at different ways that we're all working across the ecosystem with information systems and publishers and libraries and institutions and researchers and governments, and I mean everybody, we're all working with similar technologies and information, and there is a level of paralysis in making it more efficient. And so we're all, like, many of us are trying to work along the edges of that to try to influence it, but there is a level, there is a next step, which is that we all need to work together as well. So the inefficiency aspect of it is something that permeates into every decision-making process, like Yvonne was saying. And I think about, for example, like institutional decision-making, and not just within, discussions with publishers or funders, but also just internally around what's going on within an institution. So it'd be much more turnkey, and it's not, and it's the responsibility is then put on each individual group to help. And so the inefficiencies just are something that, if it was a different industry or a different community, would have already been tackled in a much more concerted way to make sure that we were solving this in a way that would scale and make the efficiencies better. And so it's nice to see that we're getting renewed interest in better metadata collectively, and not just assuming that it's something that we have to outsource the responsibilities to others, but that each individual group, each publisher, each creator of a DOI, each consumer of DOI records needs to start to get involved with to bring that efficiency numbers and higher and higher.
Anyone from the audience want to comment on that? Raise your hand if you want, or drop it into chat. I think I see Arthur. Arthur, do you want to come onto mic and make your comment?
Oh yeah, I mean, so I've I run across this in third-party data. I mean, there's places like OpenAlex or Wikidata where sometimes things are misidentified, and you can you might have an ORCID associated with somebody with a completely different name, and suddenly it seems like there are two different names associated with one ID. Or you can have, a collection of co-authors on one person that's somehow joined to a different person. And then, so if you're, trying to do some logic based on the metadata, anything that's incorrect, even one entry can mess up quite a bit of things. So, yeah, misidentification of a lot of stuff.
Anyone else? Thanks for that, Arthur.
Howard, the one example that you showed, the Sri Lanka National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka, there's about 10,000 plus or minus items out there in that were actually discovered through Chorus that are associated with the National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka. And my suspicion in looking at those is that there's about 11,000, and over 10,000, I think, are actually the U.S. National Science Foundation instead of the National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka. So incorrect. So if we're using Chorus or some other tool that looks at cross-reference for funder metadata, you miss 10,000 things that are, were actually funded by NSF, the US NSF, and then executed by some researcher that are not getting attributed into the pile of things that NSF has funded, or that researcher has done with a particular award, like you showed the award numbers. So, that's definitely a risk in terms of incorrect funder identification when you start connecting these things together in graphs and things like that, where identifiers are important of missing things. And Sasha Schwartzman is on this call. Actually, he pointed this out a number of years ago and has done a lot of great, really continually trying to help us all be more careful. And thank you, Sasha.
Yeah, I'll use that as a segue, Ted. So Sasha asked a question, actually, in the chat, specifically about what Chorus is doing during this transition time as Crossref has begun their deprecation of the Open Funder Registry in lieu of and passing over to ROAR. And you're asking, what are we doing about that? Well, so the answer is actually we've just begun work right now to analyze whether or not we can properly query Crossref for both. So meaning we'll look for records that, and we're starting to see a few records, there are not a lot of them, but a few records that actually have the ROAR ID contributed by the publisher into that record. But then we have the situation where, okay, well, fine, if it's got one or the other, we can pick it up and use it. What if it has both? Great. What if they don't match? What do we do then? Right? What if it says, the ROAR ID says Sri Lanka and the other one is the National Science Foundation. So what do we do with that? So these are situations that we're trying to grapple with now and trying to see how prevalent these situations are. But we are actually, the intention is that we intend to support both, because honestly, right now, Crossref is supporting both. And as we fade out the funder IDs, we will continue the old ingestion stream as we always had, but we will transition over to the new ROAR one. Hopefully that, Sasha, answers your question. I think I saw some other people put comments in. So Lou, do you want to come on mic and maybe comment on your thing?
Yeah, hi. Hi, I'm Lou. Yeah, I was just saying that we had done a research project and we were speaking to research data managers throughout Northern Europe. And one of the things that had come up from a Scottish institution was, as part of their workflow, a researcher at the institution had actually managed somehow to create 8 ORCID IDs. So you can imagine, in terms of the metadata, that caused them a significant issue. And out of that research report, even though this was a few years ago now, obviously back then the metadata of the research data managers that we spoke to was really poor quality. And it is a bit older now, but I'm just going to pop it into the chat. There's a link to an article where someone, because the ORCID data is available and open, had actually gone in and interrogated it and had found some specific things. So, even with the best will in the world, these systems that we have that are trying to do something really good, there's still challenges.
So we'll use that kind of as a segue here. Do you think that there's a need to figure out what are the incentives for metadata improvements? No, that's not necessarily a question for you, Lou. It's just a question for the group. Anyone want to jump in on incentives? No,
Yeah, I could probably jump in on that. One of the things we've been seeing is that if we get more fine-grained with our metadata, we're getting less labor involved because, for instance, we have certain content that has rights reservation on it, and it just says obtain consent, which means I've got to go contact somebody at ACS to find out what's going on with that content and if I have access to it or not. If we get more fine-grained with that and saying, oh, you, MIT, have access to this, no problem, go for it, and they can do it programmatically. So that's one of our big things.
So has that, and so you're from ACS, so basically has ACS then said, all right, we're going to spend actual dollars on improving our metadata because of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been part of it. We're in the process now of doing our backfile so for rights reservation specifically, we're doing our backfile of PDFs and embedding that XMP metadata that you saw in the presentation.
Gotcha. Anyone else have a comment about this?
Howard?
Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks, Mitchell. I think ACS is a great example. I happen to know that, and you're referring also to some, internal. I think there's 2 things. One is there could be internal reasons, at a publishing house, right? Managing your editorial integrity, managing management information, having better information to make an OA strategy, have insights into your customers. But also making these metadata available is a different thing, right? Not for your own internal purposes, maybe, but indeed depositing them back after approval. And I see a lot in the chat about bulk updates into Crossref and what have you. That's of course possible, right? I mean, if the publishers are updating their records and improving metadata, either through a feedback loop of the COMET initiative or themselves. There's of course always the choice, and the incentive I think is discoverability, Howard, and better reporting to research funders, and also simply doing better client service. I've had this question over the years. People ask me, what is the return on? It's a super business question. What is the return on investment of in doing this? Because it might cost money, right? Especially if you do it downstream and have to correct things after the fact. And I think that is I think it's a strange question, because you should want to do it, and it's efficient to do it yourself rather than fixing it later. But there's these two elements for internal purposes, management information, doing the right thing, but also customer satisfaction,
Right.
doing your duty, and discoverability. I think that's the most obvious one for a publisher. You want your content to be found and cited. You want to attract new submissions. Yeah.
Amanda.
Yeah, this question of incentive is one that I've thought a lot about, and I think you did allude to this, Ivana, but in talking to publishers, and again, my knowledge may not be comprehensive on this, there's a difference between public shared metadata and the internal data and or metadata that publishers are using. And what we find is that what seems to be the case is that publishers have a lot of data, even metadata, that either is in some parts of the publication process, but not all of it. It's not making it through to that public metadata in DOI records in particular. So I just think that's an important distinction to make, that often, there is metadata that publishers have that is fulfilling certain needs that they have, but it's not making it through to the public open metadata. So it's specifically that incentive that I'm always trying to think about. What can I do to incentivize publishers to share the data that very often they do have, or that they have earlier in the process, but hasn't made it through to a later part of the process, as you mentioned about manuscript submissions. Yeah.
Can I respond to that, Howard? Because
Sure. And then Ted.
The key thing in that respect I made is controlling the open data ecosystem, right? People are scraping, pooling, using anyway. That's happening. Somebody was already referring to some services doing that. And if you don't, as a publisher, have your house in order and deposit into Crossref and the repositories and what have you, people will go around and scrape and use data anyway. So the biggest incentive or encouragement, or what did you say? The incentive, is to be in control. Have them look at your truth, at your data, because otherwise they'll look at something else.
Yeah, this is super true also, not only at publishers, as Amanda mentioned, but also institutional repositories at universities or colleges or libraries. Many people working in those institutions spend a lot of time with researchers trying to help them understand the benefits of more complete metadata. And then when it goes to the step of sharing that metadata, say with DataCite in many cases, they share only the mandatory fields rather than all the other much more or very valuable metadata that they've created in this partnership with the researchers. So share your stuff is really important. Many repositories in DataCite only have the mandatory fields shared, and that solves the get me a DOI as soon as possible use case. But it doesn't solve any of the other, or even address any of the other important metadata use cases. So super important for institutional repositories to share their stuff.
Thank you. So I note that we've got a number of institutions and funders on the call. From your perspectives, what do you think are some incentives for metadata improvement? Or for that matter, what are some risks? Anyone want to touch on that? Raise your hand and then unmute. All right, John.
Okay, so I work at the University of California, so
Count.
I'm an
Certainly
institution
count.
as well. So with my UC hat on,
Yeah.
I've worked here for 10 years, and I think since the day that I started, I've kind of been amazed that a very simple use case is not achievable, which is where can I go and why can't I find a place to search for the phrase University of California and see all outputs that have ever been created? And if I say that to someone that's outside of our industry, they say, "Are you sure you can't do that?" And then, they want to know why we haven't solved that use case yet. And that is completely within our power. We are doing a lot of that kind of work in different silos, internally within institutions and institutional reporting groups, within cataloging groups. You're all doing it in publishers, funders are doing it. We're all doing it in these, information systems like Chorus or OA Switchboard. Like, we are doing aspects of this. It is why DOIs exist at some level, ORCIDs exist. It's to broadcast out that information. So it's the joining of all of those efforts up and rationalizing them that's still emerging. And I really agree with this point that, there was a compliance aspect when DOIs and ORCIDs and RORs were created that we all were excited about. We thought, if we get one, we get something. Everybody thought, you get a DOI, you get a stamp, and you've broadcast out that something exists. You get an ORCID, I exist. You get a ROR, it clarifies that the institution was involved. These types of things happened, but we're getting beyond those kind of compliance type incentives and needing to be more about actual completeness. So this idea of bad metadata versus good metadata, in many ways, it's just comprehensiveness, it's completeness, and it's moving beyond that mindset of like these identifiers are just for a compliance thing and getting us closer to this dream that we should just be able to just search for my name and find stuff that I did without having to worry about all the mess that's going to happen. And that's what that's what we should be here for. And that's what institutions, I think, are expecting from that kind of an ecosystem.
Right. Thank you. Anyone from the funder space want to speak up? No? Okay. I'm seeing a couple of things in the chat. Dan, I think you're if you can come off and ask your question, or come on and ask your question. Right? Dan O'Brien.
Yeah, hi, Howard. Yeah, so I to the earlier question about metadata that publishers may have but aren't making publicly accessible. I was curious if there's some examples that of that. I know ACS is always looking for how to add value to the ecosystem, so yeah, interested in hearing about an example or two of metadata that could be better shared.
Anyone want to comment from the, I think it was someone on the panel.
I can speak to that. Amanda French from Crossref and Roar. And Dan, I owe you an email from yesterday. I'm very Roar focused, so that's the one that I know about. And probably better not name names, but what I have heard is that for instance, I was talking to a few, I suppose I could say, so an example, and I could name several. Well, one that I think I can say publicly is Cambridge University Press, for instance, is using ROR IDs internally. Actually, Springer Nature is using ROR IDs internally as well. They've announced that's been public, but it's not yet, with a small caveat for Springer Nature, making it through to DOI metadata. So, and I know of a few other examples. And so they're using ROR IDs to help them manage OA processes. That's one of the primary uses that these publishers are doing it, but they're not yet adding them to DOI metadata. For many of the publishers that I'm talking to, and somebody mentioned this earlier in the chat, it's a technical issue actually, because they're at the typesetting stage or at the sort of XML transformation stage, they're not able to get it into Crossref metadata. So some of the service providers that I've been talking to are building this capacity in, and once they do it, that last kind of wall between the publisher's internal metadata and the Crossref DOI will come tumbling down, and it will be very exciting. So that's the one example that I know of. But
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. And that describes ACS well too. We're using ROAR internally for business analytics, but updating our operating systems and publishing systems to leverage ROAR is still on the horizon.
Yvonne?
Yeah, I recognize and I echo what Amanda's saying, but it's a choice. It's not the fault of any technical system or solution. It's again, what is the incentive? It's a choice. That what is really important is that the JETS XML standard, which is an industry standard, allows for almost everything. There's only one thing we've recently requested at the NISO Plus conference is to distinguish between publication funder and research funder. That needs to be improved, but everything else, whether you have ROAR or Ringgold, the type of identifier, the identifier, the number itself, etc., it's all in the JETS XML. So the point is interoperability indeed, and it's simply a choice of having these data that you have in your various systems or with your vendors included. And yeah, that might cost money. So I always say it's not rocket science, it's hard work, and it might cost money. It's doable, and there are publishers who do. We are preparing some case studies, and ACS is amongst them, and also Rockefeller University Press, American Microbiology Society, Beilstein. I can go on. There's about 10 or 15 publishers who actually have these crucial metadata and identifiers in their JETS XML, and then they will also make it into COSRED. So it's doable, and we are really aiming to contribute to showing the world there's possibilities, there's examples of best practices of how you do it.
John, is your comment on this or something different?
It's on this.
Great.
Just to say that I do think it's an important question of what are we specifically talking about? The term metadata means different things to different people, and most people just think it's just a blob of information, don't think very deep when you say the word. It's jargon. So I do think it's important for when you have these kind of conversations to just cut to the chase, like what are we talking about? And so I put a list of 10 items that we've been isolating in our work. There are others, of course, but we're not talking about, metadata in the sense of just endless cataloging and everythingness about every piece of minutia. We're talking about like, what are the kind of search facety type things that we all want to pivot off of when we're looking for information? That's really what it is. And it's about the completeness and the, common best practice around each of those items. And so, I think that there's this kind of conversation is very helpful, but it's also good to have that gut chat, like Dan just said, which is like, what are we really talking about?
Yep.
And then also talk about how do we really work carefully and consistently and specifically on these items in collectively.
So, Mitch, before I get to you, so John, thank you for that. You would think I queued up John to actually do this. So this workshop series that we envisioned, and by the way, this workshop was part of the output of a Chorus Technical Working Group discussion, whereby we said, well, what could we do with the public in a workshop kind of fashion? And we said, well, metadata, improving metadata could be something that we really could work on. But one of the things that we all said was that we don't want to try to stir the ocean, right? We don't want to try to improve metadata at large. We've all been part of lots of initiatives in the past that have tried to do that, and they've gotten caught up in, very quickly hitting the boundaries or stretching the boundaries, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and never went anywhere, never did anything. So one of the things I wanted to try to achieve out of today, and there's roughly about half an hour left, 20 minutes, is to do exactly kind of what John just said, is what specific metadata can we all agree that we want to focus in on? John's given us a list of 10, which I cut and paste into the whiteboard, which is a very useful list. But I was curious, from this community that has gathered today, what of these 10 or others do we feel, that the next workshop should really focus on improving? Because that would be the focus of our next workshop. But then Mitch, I want to get to you.
Yeah, I was noticing in the chat, Colin from APS putting something about doing kind of a health check and scoring. And yes, we do have health checks out there, but I found the idea of a score, and maybe that's what deals with these 10 things that we're talking about, is those are contributing to a score for a publisher that may be something that would be of interest or something to discuss.
And Scope 3 is a good model for that, I think.
Anyone else have a comment?
You know, I think lists of small numbers of metadata elements are sort of an interesting thing. I mean, we've been doing them for a million years. And when you look at large repositories of many, thousands of metadata records, what you find, and this is certainly true at data site, is, when you make a list of minimum metadata, that's what you get. So in the evaluation that we do, we're looking at about 60 fields, and many of them are related with one another. But when you're talking about improving metadata, starting with a list of 10 things only helps you if you're interested in having repositories that only have 10 things in them. Minimum metadata, this whole using the word minimum and metadata in the same sentence, is really not helpful here. And making these little lists that we've made since the beginning of time, we know what that leads to. It leads to the situation that we're in. So, when you're looking at improvements, you need to think big. And big isn't necessarily hard, but you need to go big, not small. That's my experience. You can go in small, you can get to big by small steps. And that's fine, but starting out with a list of 10 things means you'll end up with 10 things.
Yeah, but I think personally, I would say in my experience is that if you can get those 10 things, I mean, first of all, it'd be amazing to get those 10 things because I think John's list of 10, we could argue whether or not those are the right 10 or whatever, but those 10 are, many of them, I already gave you examples of at least 3 of them that are not good now, right? That are they're very inconsistent, especially number 3 is very inconsistent. Yes, Ted, you can try to stir the ocean, but what we've discovered personally and being involved in a lot of these different initiatives over the years is that they just won't end up going anywhere. So, I always say if you're gonna build something, you gotta figure out what are the bottom rungs that you want to actually build first. John.
I kind of agree with what you're saying, but I also agree with Ted. I mean, the point that I think we need to make by creating lists or prioritizing or talking about fields individually, it's something that came up in the Comet task force, which is we start to think of the metadata fields as features, and then how do we do feature development? And it's not about saying that you shouldn't care about all 60 or whatever Ted's saying. It's more about like in any sort of product development process, you start saying, well, what are something as a community we can come together and do outreach and figure out what's important and what is a process for developing this feature, and think of each field as a feature and just use common kind of development processes to say, hey, this is the way that we should be working on things. And it's not about that we don't want to get to all 60 or all 60. I mean, I'm using 60 as a placeholder because Ted mentioned that number, but whatever the whole comprehensive number is that we want to say, or 60 and beyond, it's not that we don't care about all of them. It's more around like, what are the things that we can tackle as features for the community together that are pivotal for the type of work and use cases we're all trying to solve. So, I kind of think that we're all saying similar things at some level. We're just trying to figure out how to get started.
John, you're a better diplomat than me. Well done. Anyone else have something that they want to add here, especially from our audience? I saw some voting going on. Then anyone want to comment about their votes that they were saying in there? And Amanda, I saw your comment about, what role should Crossref play? You'll notice here, we didn't specifically invite any of the PID registrars to our panel because we often do hear from them, but obviously they have a very big role to play, and obviously they will be consulted. And I wanted to make that clear. So Amanda, I do appreciate that you showed up and you registered for it. But yeah, they're really important to our community, and they are important players in this as well.
Can I make a quick comment
Of course.
about that? Yeah, I'm actually very interested in Matt's question. You know, I think the short answer is yes, there is a bigger role to play. I think one of the fascinating things about the presentations that we've heard today is that they're reasonable people can disagree about what that role is. So, for instance, one thing that Crossref could do and does do is to talk continually to publishers and attempting to encourage them, sometimes on an individual basis or more on a group basis, to improve the metadata. Hosting tools like the prep report, which we shared in the chat. But another potential role for Crossref is to do that kind of large scale metadata enrichment in Crossref metadata. And those are two different approaches. So yeah, I'd be interested in which ones people would prefer or others that people might suggest.
There's even a third model, Amanda, that I've heard in the comment context, which is, okay, so you've got these individual silos that have things fixed. And maybe the original publisher is not that interested in updating their metadata, which is sad, right? But let's just say that's true. And maybe, or there's maybe a cost reason. And maybe the PID provider can't do it or their own policies. But is there a way to then feed it back down to all that are interested, right, after it's been fully vetted? So there's lots of different permutations of this, I think.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Arthur, I saw that you had a question I think that we haven't answered. I don't know if you want to come on mic and ask your question.
I think we've discussed it enough. Yeah, that's fine.
Fair enough. Want to make sure that if people want to be heard, they can be heard. So what do people think about these 10? I mean, do we feel that doing another workshop to really focus on how to improve some of these 10 would be of value to the community? Because we've all decided, I think we've said here that obviously that there are problems, right? And I think we're all gathered today to think that we want to do something about it. The question is, you know, who should do it? What should we do? And what should we act on? Any thoughts? Yvonne.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. I think, and it's building on what I mentioned before, I think it would be really helpful and practical and inspirational to hear from some publishers who actually are doing this, how they've approached it, how they've done it, how they get it into Crossref, how they manage to pull some of these metadata indeed from different internal systems, but are managing to put it all together and get it into JETS XML and into Crossref. So rather than, that's also my personal preference always to theoretically talk about this, I think really, how do I get started? How have others done it? What are the lessons learned? And how can you do it? And there are those out there who I think have all 10 in order. I think I know them. So yeah, I would invite them and I would do a workshop and talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. Mark. Mark
Hi,
Donovan.
Howard. Mark from IEEE. I know that as far as this list of 10 metadata items is concerned, the last couple of years I've been doing a lot of work in the research integrity space, and I know that some of these are very important as far as having quality metadata is very beneficial to allowing us to try to protect the reputation of our publications and then the scholarly record. So it is, if I were going to, well, I'd say I'm a metadata maximalist, so I think more is better, but I do think some are more important than others, and this 10 definitely is a good start. And for a workshop, I'm wondering if you were to sort of position it, or at least include the perspective of research integrity. That might be, get the attention of some of the publishers who need to, pay more attention to these, at least 10 basic items of metadata.
Okay, you want to thought it was a hand, but it's a thumbs up. Okay. Anyone else want to contribute to that? Anyone from the panel or from our audience? Okay, well, I think that gives us a good lead. Anything else that anyone else wants to raise today? Because I've realized that we're coming up on the tail end here. Okay. Not hearing anything or seeing anything. Tara, do you see anything that I'm missing?
No, I think you've captured everything, and thanks to everyone who's come on and asked a question.
Okay, so I want to thank everyone. I thought it was a really useful session. Thank you. Hopefully you did too. And we'll be sharing the video and presentations in a few days. I want to thank all of our panelists. You were awesome in all the contributions that you've made before the session and during the session. I also want to thank our sponsors, AIP Publishing, Springer Nature, Silverchair, and STM. And enjoy the rest of your week and keep a lookout for more events from us at Chorus, and we hope to see you soon. So thanks, everyone.